Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently it was a heart attack. He was found at his home in Memphis, not breathing.
For decades, the official story of Elvis Presley's last morning went mostly unquestioned. A heart simply stopped. Nothing more complicated than that. Dick Grobb knew otherwise almost immediately because he was there. He was the one Vernon Presley personally asked to find out the truth. What he eventually pieced together, and what he has only said plainly in his later years, does not match the version the world was given that first afternoon. Today, we go through what Grobb actually found and why the official story left so much out. The man Vernon trusted to find the truth.
I talked with him that morning from between about 4 in the morning till about 4:30, just before he went down.
In the weeks following his son's funeral, Vernon Presley called Dick Grobb into a quiet room at Graceland. The request he made that day was simple in its wording and enormous in its weight. Find out what really happened. Vernon did not want comfort. He had buried his only child, and platitudes about fate or timing were not going to satisfy a father who had personally watched warning signs accumulate for nearly 2 years. He wanted facts. He wanted someone with investigative training, someone who already understood the household's inner workings, to look honestly at the final months and determine what the official, public version of events had actually left out. Grobb was uniquely positioned for this task. Before joining Presley's world, he had served as a police officer in Palm Springs, California, where he first met Elvis in 1967, under unusual circumstances entirely unrelated to investigation or security. Over the following decade, that early friendship grew into something far more significant. Grobb became Presley's chief of security, eventually managing tour logistics, venue security, and the daily protective operation surrounding one of the most famous men alive. This combination, genuine law enforcement training, paired with nearly a decade of intimate access to the household, made Grobb the obvious choice once Vernon decided he needed answers beyond what the initial press conference and toxicology reports had provided. Vernon trusted him precisely because Grobb had spent years proving himself trustworthy in exactly this kind of careful, discreet work. The investigation that followed took Grobb back through records, conversations, and timelines he had lived through, but never fully assembled into one continuous picture. He had been present, though not in the room itself, when the household's chaos began that August morning. He had watched the immediate aftermath unfold, the ambulance, the press inquiries arriving within the hour, the practical impossibility of managing both genuine grief and a global news story breaking simultaneously around a family that had just lost everything. What struck Grobb almost immediately, once he began looking closely at the actual sequence of events from that morning, was how quickly an official explanation had been delivered to the public, and how little of the underlying complexity that explanation actually reflected. The medical examiner's announcement of cardiac arrhythmia had gone out within hours. The deeper context, the medication patterns, the specific instructions given to staff about what information should be shared with emergency responders, the warning signs accumulated over the preceding 2 years. None of that had been part of the version delivered to the world that first afternoon. Grobb's law enforcement background gave him a specific instinct for this kind of gap. He understood from years of police work that initial statements made in the immediate aftermath of a sudden death are often necessarily incomplete, shaped by the urgency of the moment rather than the fuller picture that only emerges through careful, subsequent investigation. What troubled him was not that the original announcement had been incomplete. Initial statements often are. What troubled him was how little correction or elaboration followed in the months and years afterward, even as more complete information became available through the toxicology results and later through the 1981 trial of Dr. George Nichopoulos. This gap between the original, simplified public story and the more complicated reality Grobb slowly assembled through his own investigation became the defining tension of the work Vernon had asked him to undertake. He was not chasing a hidden conspiracy. He found no evidence of foul play, no secret enemy, nothing resembling the more sensational theories that occasionally circulated in tabloid coverage during this period. What he found instead was something quieter and, in its own way, more uncomfortable. A household that had gradually normalized warning signs over nearly 2 years, and an official public narrative that had locked into place within hours before anyone fully understood what those 2 years of warning signs actually added up to. Grob conducted this investigation carefully, speaking with medical staff who had treated Presley during his 1975 hospitalizations, reviewing what he could of the prescribing patterns that had already begun drawing scrutiny even before Nicopolis's eventual trial, and comparing his own first-hand observations from his years managing security with what other household staff recalled from the final weeks and months. The picture that slowly emerged did not fit neatly into the version of events the public had been given on August 17, 1977. It also did not fit neatly into the darker, conspiratorial alternative that some fans and tabloid writers preferred. It sat uncomfortably in between, a genuine medical tragedy, years in the making, that the original public explanation had compressed into something far simpler than the reality actually supported. Grob would carry this more complicated understanding privately for years following his investigation, eventually channeling it into a book published in 1996, and later into a series of more direct, candid interviews, given much later in his life. Once enough time had passed that he felt able to discuss what he had actually found, without disrupting the family that had trusted him with the original task. What he found began, specifically, with a single instruction given inside Graceland on the morning Elvis Presley died, an instruction that would shape the entire trajectory of the official story for years afterward. Antibiotics and nothing else. Within the chaos of August 16, 1977, one specific instruction would later become central to Dick Grob's understanding of how incomplete the official story actually was from its very first hour. According to Dr. George Nicopolis's own later account, given decades afterward in interviews addressing that morning directly, he instructed a member of the household staff, Charlie Hodge, to tell anyone who asked that Presley had only been taking antibiotics recently. Nothing stronger, nothing connected to the broader medication routine that had defined his final 2 years. This instruction went out before paramedics arrived, before the ambulance ride to Baptist Memorial Hospital, before any formal medical or administrative process had begun addressing what had actually happened inside that bathroom. It was, in effect, the first piece of the public story, shaping the information available to emergency responders and, soon afterward, to the press, well before any toxicology results or formal investigation could establish the fuller picture. Grob, reconstructing the morning's timeline during his investigation for Vernon, recognized the significance of this instruction immediately, drawing on his own law enforcement training. Withholding accurate medication and history from emergency responders carries genuine risk in any medical emergency, since accurate information can directly affect treatment decisions made in the field and at the hospital. Whether or not the instruction changed anything about the medical outcome that specific morning, given how far the crisis had likely already progressed by the time anyone intervened, it nonetheless represented the first moment where the version of events being communicated outward diverged from the more complicated reality inside the house. Nicopolis defended this instruction, when later asked about it directly, as an attempt to protect Presley's privacy and dignity during an already devastating, chaotic morning, rather than as any deliberate effort to mislead investigators about something that might affect the ultimate medical or legal outcome. Grob's own assessment, reflected in his later writing and interviews, took a more measured view than either harsh accusation or full acceptance. He understood the instinct to protect the dying friend's privacy in the immediate, overwhelming moment. He also recognized that this instinct, however understandable, set a tone that the rest of that day's official communication would largely follow. This pattern continued once Presley arrived at Baptist Memorial Hospital. Medical examiner Jerry Francisco, working alongside Nicopolis, arrived at cardiac arrhythmia as the official cause of death, a conclusion Francisco announced publicly within hours of Presley's death, well before full toxicology results had returned from the laboratory. Grob's investigation, conducted years later with the benefit of hindsight and access to the fuller toxicology record, found this same pattern repeating itself. A simple, quickly delivered public explanation followed much later by considerably more complicated information that never fully displaced the original, simpler version in popular memory. The The toxicology results, once they returned several weeks after Presley's death, identified 14 different substances in his system. This information did not match the simple, antibiotics-only framing given to staff and indirectly to early responders that first morning. It also did not fully match the simple cardiac arrhythmia explanation given to the public that same afternoon, an explanation that, while not technically inaccurate regarding the immediate physical mechanism of death, omitted any reference to the broader medication context that had likely contributed significantly to creating the conditions for that cardiac event in the first place. Grob's investigation specifically traced how this initial framing, established within the very first hours through Nicopolis's instruction to staff, set a kind of narrative momentum that proved difficult to fully correct, even once more complete information became available. Once a public explanation takes hold, particularly one delivered with the apparent authority of medical professionals on the day of a sudden death. Correcting or substantially complicating that explanation later requires considerably more public attention and sustained scrutiny than simply maintaining the original version, which by then has already become the default understanding most people carry forward. This dynamic frustrated Grob considerably as he worked through the fuller timeline during his investigation for Vernon. He found himself reconstructing a sequence of events where the earliest, least complete information had effectively become the lasting public record, while the more accurate, more complicated reality only fully emerged years later through toxicology reviews, through the 1981 trial testimony, and eventually through his own careful, independent reconstruction of what he had personally witnessed and subsequently investigated. Grob did not view the antibiotics instruction itself as the central failure of that morning. He understood it within the broader context of a devastated, overwhelmed household, trying to manage an unprecedented crisis in real time, with no preparation for exactly this kind of simultaneous medical emergency and global media event. What concerned him more, reflecting on the fuller pattern years later, was how that initial, incomplete framing had never been meaningfully revisited or corrected by anyone with the authority and information to do so clearly, even once the toxicology results and later trial testimony had made the fuller picture available. This pattern, an incomplete initial story that simply persisted by default rather than through any deliberate, sustained effort to maintain it, would recur throughout Grob's broader investigation, extending well beyond this single instruction into the very speed and simplicity of the official cause of death itself, announced to the world within hours of a death that, as Grob's own later research would reveal, had actually been years in the making. A cause of death announced too fast.
Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently it was a heart attack. He was found at his home in Memphis.
August the 17th, 1977, one day after Elvis Presley's death. Medical examiner Jerry Francisco stood before reporters and delivered an explanation that would define public understanding of that morning for decades. Cardiac arrhythmia, a sudden, fatal disruption of the heart's rhythm. Nothing more specific offered to the gathered press. Dick Grob, reconstructing this same sequence years later during his investigation for Vernon Presley, found himself returning repeatedly to the sheer speed of this announcement. An autopsy had been performed. A press conference had followed within hours. Full toxicology results, the laboratory analysis that would eventually reveal 14 different substances in Presley's system, had not yet come back from testing. Francisco's announcement, delivered with the apparent confidence and authority the public expected from an official medical examiner, rested on a foundation considerably less complete than its tone suggested. Grob's law enforcement background gave him a specific practical understanding of how this kind of speed typically functions in genuine investigative work, and how it differs from what actually happened in Presley's case. Preliminary statements following sudden deaths are common and often necessary, particularly when grieving families and an anxious public need some initial explanation, while more detailed forensic work continues. What troubled Grob, examining the fuller record years later, was not that a preliminary statement had been given. It was that this preliminary statement effectively became the final, lasting public explanation, with remarkably little official correction or elaboration following once the more complete toxicology picture eventually emerged weeks later. This gap between preliminary and final explanation mattered enormously to Grob's broader investigation. Vernon had asked him to find out what really happened, not simply to confirm or repeat what had already been told to the press. Grob's work required him to look past the original announcement entirely, treating it as a starting point for inquiry rather than a settled conclusion, in much the same way his earlier police training had taught him to treat any initial statement given in the immediate aftermath of a serious incident. What Grob found, piecing together hospital records, toxicology results, and his own first-hand knowledge of Presley's final 2 years, was a picture considerably more complicated than simple cardiac arrhythmia suggested on its own. The medication patterns Nicopolis had been managing for years, the documented liver and colon issues from the 1975 hospitalizations, the cumulative physical strain Grob himself had quietly observed accumulating throughout his final 2 years working security at Graceland. All of this connected directly to the cardiac event that finally occurred that August morning. Yet none of it had been part of the version delivered to reporters within 24 hours of Presley's death. Grob's own framing of this gap, articulated more fully in later interviews and in his book, drew a careful distinction that mattered considerably to his broader understanding. Cardiac arrhythmia was not, in his assessment, technically false. The heart had genuinely stopped beating in a normal rhythm. But describing only this immediate physical mechanism without any reference to the years of accumulated strain that had made such an event increasingly likely created a version of the truth that was accurate in its narrowest sense while remaining deeply incomplete in any meaningful, fuller sense. This distinction between technically accurate and meaningfully complete became something Grob returned to repeatedly across his later reflections on the case. He had spent years personally observing the warning signs accumulate, the prescriptions, the hospitalizations, the gradual physical decline that had become normalized within the household over time. Hearing the official explanation reduced to a single, narrow medical term, delivered within hours and never substantially revisited afterward, struck him as a profound simplification of something he had watched unfold gradually and painfully over nearly 2 years. Grob's investigation specifically examined why this gap between technical accuracy and fuller truth had never been meaningfully closed in the years immediately following Presley's death. Part of the explanation, in his assessment, connected to simple institutional momentum. Once Francisco's announcement became the established public record, correcting or substantially elaborating on it would have required sustained, deliberate effort from people with both the authority and the motivation to do so, a combination that, in the chaotic, grief-stricken aftermath of Presley's death, simply did not materialize in any organized, sustained way. The 1981 trial of Dr. Nicopolis did eventually bring considerably more detailed information into public record, including the full prescription volumes and expert medical testimony addressing the broader pattern of his treatment. But even this proceeding focused primarily on the specific question of Nicopolis's criminal liability, rather than on directly revising or replacing the original cardiac arrhythmia explanation that remained throughout the trial and afterward the technically unchallenged official cause of death. This left Grob, completing his investigation for Vernon, in a position where he understood considerably more about what had actually happened than the public record technically reflected. Even though nothing he had found directly contradicted the narrow, technical accuracy of Francisco's original announcement, the official story was not, in this sense, a lie. It was something more subtle and, in some ways, more difficult to address directly. A true but radically incomplete account, delivered with enough speed and apparent authority that it simply never received the fuller elaboration the actual circumstances deserved. Grob carried this understanding forward into the most difficult part of his entire investigation, the specific question Vernon had actually asked him to answer most directly. Not simply what had caused Presley's death in a narrow medical sense, but whether anything could have been done differently on that specific morning to change the outcome his father had been left to live with for the remainder of his own life. The question, Vernon, actually wanted answered, beneath every detail. Dick Grob uncovered about the antibiotics instruction and the speed of the official cause of death sat the one question Vernon Presley had actually asked him to answer. Could his son have been saved? Grob approached this question with the same careful, methodical instinct his police training had given him for every other part of the investigation. He understood, almost immediately, that the question as Vernon had posed it was too broad to answer cleanly. Could Elvis have been saved, in some general sense, from the cumulative damage of nearly 2 years of declining health? Was a question without any honest, useful answer. The damage by that point had simply progressed too far for any single moment of intervention to fully reverse. Grob narrowed the question instead, reframing it into something he could actually examine with the evidence available to him. Not whether years of accumulated strain could have been undone, but whether help, called earlier on that specific morning, might have changed what happened in those final hours. This reframing mattered enormously to how he approached the remainder of his investigation, and to how he would eventually discuss the question publicly decades later. Reconstructing the timeline of that final morning required Grob to work through the same overlapping, sometimes inconsistent accounts that any careful investigator faces when piecing together a sequence nobody had thought to document precisely as it happened. Presley's racquetball session with his cousin Billy Smith in the early morning hours, the piano session that followed, the nighttime medication routine, administered according to an established, familiar pattern rather than anything unusual for that specific night. Ginger Alden going to bed around 4 in the morning, with Presley telling her he wanted to read before joining her. What followed, in Grob's reconstruction, represented the most significant gap in the entire timeline. Nobody checked on Presley directly for close to 10 hours, until Ginger woke in the early afternoon and discovered him unresponsive. Grob's investigation treated this gap with considerable care, resisting the simpler, more dramatic conclusion that an obvious recoverable opportunity had been missed throughout that entire window. Medical evidence Grob reviewed suggested the actual cardiac event had likely occurred relatively early within that gap, probably not long after Presley entered the bathroom around 4 in the morning, based on his physical condition and positioning when he was eventually found. This meant the realistic window during which any intervention might have changed the outcome was almost certainly much narrower than the full 9 to 10 hour gap might initially suggest to someone encountering the timeline for the first time. This conclusion mattered enormously to how Grob ultimately answered Vernon's question, and to how he would later discuss it in his own book and subsequent interviews. He never claimed certainty that earlier intervention would have failed. He also never claimed certainty that it would have succeeded. What he offered instead, consistently across every account he gave for the remainder of his life, was a narrower, more honest uncertainty. If help had been summoned within the first hour or two after Presley entered that bathroom, rather than nearly 10 hours later, the outcome might genuinely have been different. By the time anyone actually checked, the window had likely already closed. Grob's reflections on why nobody checked sooner avoided assigning blame to any single person inside that household. He understood, from his own years working inside Graceland, exactly how the household's collective sense of normal had shifted gradually over the preceding 2 years. Long stretches of silence from Presley's bedroom and adjoining bathroom had become unremarkable, a pattern that had developed slowly enough that nobody inside the house, including people who genuinely cared for him deeply, fully recognized how dangerous that normalized pattern had actually become. This insight, more than any single specific finding about timing or medication, became the most significant conclusion Grob carried forward from his investigation. The household had not failed through negligence or indifference. It had failed through a kind of slow, collective adaptation, the same adaptation Grob recognized with considerable personal discomfort in his own professional conduct during those final 2 years. He had been trained throughout his law enforcement career to treat irregularities seriously and escalate concerns before they became emergencies. Yet inside Graceland, across nearly a decade, he had watched his own instincts dull slightly, adjusting gradually to a household where irregularity had quietly become the baseline. Grob delivered his findings to Vernon sometime after completing this investigation, though no detailed public record exists of exactly how that specific conversation unfolded. What is clear, based on Grob's own later reflections, is that he did not deliver the clean, simple resolution Vernon had originally hoped for when he first made the request. He delivered something more honest and considerably harder to sit with. A genuine, narrowed uncertainty about one specific morning, layered onto a broader, clearer understanding of how 2 years of gradual normalization had created the conditions for that morning to unfold exactly as it did. This distinction between the broad, unanswerable question of whether Presley could have been saved generally, and the narrower, more honest question of whether earlier action that specific morning might have mattered, represents the core of what Grob's investigation actually uncovered, that the original public story had never addressed at all. The official version offered a single medical term and a same-day press conference. Grob's investigation, conducted carefully over the following years, offered something the public had never been given, a genuine accounting of exactly where the real opportunity for intervention had existed, and exactly how narrow that opportunity had actually been. That accounting would not become fully public for nearly 2 decades, and even then, only in carefully measured pieces. Why it took decades to say plainly. Dick Grob completed his investigation for Vernon Presley sometime in the months and years following 1977. He did not go public with his findings immediately. Nearly 2 decades would pass before any substantial portion of what he had uncovered reached a wider audience, and even then, only in carefully measured form. Several factors shaped this extended delay, factors Grob himself addressed, at least partially, in his later reflections on the case. The most immediate concerned timing and grief. Vernon Presley had asked for the investigation privately, as a father seeking his own understanding, not as the basis for a public campaign to correct the official record. Grob respected that original framing. The findings belonged first and most directly to Vernon, and Vernon died in 1979, less than 2 years after first asking Grob to look into what had really happened, without ever publicly revisiting the question himself. This left Grob holding findings that had been commissioned privately by a man no longer alive to decide how, or whether, they should reach a broader audience. This situation alone might reasonably explain considerable hesitation about going public quickly or dramatically, with conclusions that complicated the official story. Beyond this immediate concern, Grob also had to consider his own ongoing relationships within the broader Presley family and business operation. He continued working at Graceland through 1980, remaining connected to people who had their own complicated relationships with exactly the questions his investigation had examined, publicly contradicting or substantially complicating the official cause of death, particularly regarding the antibiotics instruction and the speed of Francisco's original announcement, risked reopening genuinely painful territory for people still processing their own grief, including Lisa Marie Presley, still a child during this period, who would eventually inherit both Graceland and the broader responsibility of managing her father's public legacy. Grob's own career trajectory also played a role in the timing of his eventual disclosures. He left Graceland in 1980, transitioning into an entirely different field, eventually working in engineering and safety systems installation for a major company. This career shift moved him physically and professionally away from the daily orbit of Presley's legacy management, reducing both his proximity to ongoing family sensitivities and his immediate need to navigate those sensitivities carefully in his daily professional life. By the mid-1990s, enough time had passed, and enough of the broader factual record had already become public through the 1981 Nicopolis trial that Grob apparently felt the moment had arrived to share his own, more complete investigative account directly. His book, The Elvis Conspiracy, published in 1996, represented his first substantial public effort to address what his investigation had actually found, nearly 2 decades after Vernon had first asked him to look into it. Even this disclosure, however, arrived in a notably measured, careful form. The title itself suggested something more sensational than the actual content delivered. Readers expecting a dramatic story about hidden enemies or deliberate cover-up found instead a methodical, procedural account, consistent with Grob's law enforcement background, focused on dates, sequences, and careful documentation rather than dramatic accusation. This restraint reflected in its own way the same careful caution that had shaped his decision to wait nearly 20 years before publishing anything at all. The book's relatively measured public reception, compared to more sensationalized treatments of Presley's death circulating during the same period, may have further shaped how openly Grob chose to discuss his findings in subsequent years. Without a dramatic, attention-grabbing revelation to draw sustained media attention, his more careful, complicated account did not achieve the same widespread public recognition or correction of the original cardiac arrhythmia narrative that a more sensational framing might have generated. Even though Grob's actual findings arguably offered something more valuable, a genuinely careful, honest reconstruction rather than speculative drama. It was only later in his life, through a series of more candid, detailed interviews given across his final years, that Grob discussed his findings with the kind of direct, unguarded clarity that had been largely absent from his earlier, more cautious book. These later conversations allowed him to articulate, more plainly than his 1996 book had managed, the specific narrowed uncertainty at the heart of his investigation. Not whether Presley could have been saved broadly, but whether earlier action on that specific morning might have mattered, and his own genuine, unresolved feelings about a household, including himself, that had gradually lost the ability to recognize danger that had become too familiar to register as dangerous anymore. This pattern, a private investigation completed quickly but disclosed gradually and incompletely over nearly 3 decades, reflects something significant about how difficult, complicated truths involving beloved public figures often surface in public memory. The official story, delivered with speed and apparent authority within 24 hours of Presley's death, had decades to settle into public consciousness essentially unchallenged. Grob's more complete, more honest account, despite being substantially completed by the early 1980s, took considerably longer to reach the public, and even then arrived in pieces, first through a carefully restrained book, later through more direct but still measured interviews given only in his final years. This timeline gap between when Grob actually knew what he knew and when he finally said it plainly enough for the public to fully absorb it, represents its own kind of quiet tragedy layered onto the original one. The fuller truth had existed, documented and understood by at least one person with genuine investigative standing, for nearly the entire span of time that the simpler, incomplete official story dominated public memory virtually unchallenged. What finally changed in his last years was not new evidence. It was simply Grob's own growing willingness to say plainly what he had quietly understood for decades. What his account actually changes. Dick Grob's investigation, completed quietly for Vernon Presley and only fully disclosed in pieces across the following decades, does not overturn the basic facts of August 16, 1977. Elvis Presley still died that day at Baptist Memorial Hospital following a cardiac event that occurred sometime after he entered his bathroom in the early morning hours. Nothing in Grob's account disputes this core, unchanged reality. What his account changes is the texture and completeness surrounding that core fact, replacing a simple same-day explanation with something considerably more accurate to what actually happened across the final 2 years of Presley's life and across the specific hours of his final morning. The antibiotics instruction given to staff that morning, intended to protect privacy in an overwhelming moment, instead became the first small distortion in a chain of incomplete information that shaped how the entire day was understood by emergency responders, by reporters, and eventually by the public. Grob's investigation traced this distortion clearly, without assigning malicious intent to anyone involved, while still insisting on naming it honestly for what it was. A small, understandable choice in a moment of crisis that nonetheless shaped the earliest, most foundational layer of public understanding. The speed of Francisco's cardiac arrhythmia announcement, delivered within hours and never substantially revisited even once fuller toxicology results emerged weeks later, represents the second piece Grob's account meaningfully complicates. Not false, in the narrowest technical sense, but radically incomplete in any sense that mattered to genuinely understanding what had happened and why. Grob's own law enforcement training had taught him to treat preliminary statements as starting points rather than conclusions. The public, lacking that same training and that same instinct toward continued scrutiny, had little reason to treat Francisco's announcement as anything other than final and complete. The third and most significant piece involves the question Vernon had actually asked Grob to answer. Not whether Presley could have been saved from years of accumulated decline, an unanswerable and ultimately unfair question to ask of any single morning, but whether earlier action specifically on August the 16th might have changed the outcome. Grob's narrowed, honest uncertainty on this point, His recognition that the realistic window for intervention was likely much smaller than the full overnight gap suggested, and his unflinching acknowledgement that the household's gradual normalization of danger, his own included, had quietly closed that window before anyone recognized it needed closing at all, offers something the original public story never attempted to provide. This is where Grob's account carries genuine, lasting significance beyond simple historical correction. It does not replace one clean story with another, equally clean alternative. It replaces a falsely simple story with an honestly complicated one, acknowledging uncertainty where uncertainty genuinely exists, while still naming clearly the specific points where the official narrative diverged from what a careful, trained investigator with intimate household knowledge actually found upon looking closely. For researchers and historians who have studied Presley's death in the decades since, Grob's account, pieced together gradually through his 1996 book and his later, more candid interviews, has become an important supplementary source precisely because of this honesty about uncertainty. He never claimed to have solved a mystery or uncovered a hidden conspiracy. He claimed something more modest and, in its way, more valuable. A genuine good faith reconstruction of what actually happened, conducted by someone with both the professional training and the personal access necessary to look honestly at material the original public story had never fully examined. This matters for how the broader public should understand not just Presley's death specifically, but the general pattern by which official explanations for sudden, complicated deaths often take hold quickly and then persist, essentially unchallenged, regardless of how much fuller, more accurate information eventually becomes available through subsequent investigation. The original cardiac arrhythmia announcement was not a lie. It was a preliminary statement that simply never received the correction or elaboration the actual circumstances deserved, in part because the people with the most complete understanding, Grob included, took decades to share what they had found. This pattern extends well beyond Presley's individual case. Addiction specialists, medical historians, and researchers studying high-profile deaths generally have pointed to cases like this one as evidence of a broader, recurring dynamic. The first explanation offered to the public, particularly when delivered with apparent medical or official authority, tends to calcify into permanent public understanding, regardless of how much more complete information eventually surfaces through trials, investigations, or first-hand accounts from people who were actually present. Correcting an established public narrative requires far more sustained effort and attention than establishing one in the first place. A structural imbalance that left Grob's more complete, more honest findings competing against decades of unchallenged simplicity. Grob carried this complicated, narrowed understanding for the remainder of his life, discussing it more openly only in his final years, once enough distance from the original event and enough sensitivity toward a family that had already endured so much, allowed him to finally say plainly what his investigation had actually concluded decades earlier. He watched, throughout those decades, as the simplified version continued circulating, largely unchallenged in documentaries, retrospectives, and casual retellings, even as he personally held a more complete, more carefully reconstructed account the entire time. What his account ultimately offers, more than any specific factual correction, is a model for how complicated truths about beloved public figures can eventually surface honestly, without requiring either harsh accusation or continued comfortable silence. Grob never set out to tear down Presley's legacy or to assign blame to specific individuals for what happened that morning. He set out simply to answer a grieving father's question as honestly as the available evidence allowed, and he eventually found the words, late in his own life, to share that honest, complicated answer with anyone willing to listen carefully enough to hear it. The official story of Elvis Presley's last morning was never entirely false. It was simply far less complete than it appeared, delivered with a speed and confidence the actual circumstances never fully supported. Dick Grob spent decades knowing this. The world is only now catching up to what he already understood, piece by piece, exactly the way he chose to share it. The official story was never a lie. It was simply never finished. Dick Grob spent his life completing it quietly, then finally said so plainly decades later.